Well, hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started. I want to say good evening, but I know we're on recording and people could be watching this at any time. We're excited that this is recording for our archives. This will actually go up on our YouTube channel, and so people can watch it at going again and again, and they can share it with friends and family. Very, very excited to be welcoming back our dear friend and colleague, Lincoln Cushing. He is an independent archivist and historian, and he is a very good friend of our national park that the Rosie the Riveter Trust represents. We're the official nonprofit partner of Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park. As you can see right there, that is their logo. That is their representation of Rosie the Riveter. And in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to Lincoln, where he's going to tell us a little bit more about the iconic Rosie that I think we're more familiar with. And just to tell you a little bit about the Trust, we have a myriad of programs that support preservation work and outreach to youth. We have a flagship program called Rosie Service Corps, and we work to support women in the trades. So there's a lot of things we do. I highly recommend that you go to rosietheriveter.org and you see more of our information. We absolutely would love for you to sign up, get our newsletter, become a member, and just check out our website to see what events we have going on. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Lincoln Cushing for an exciting evening, a beautiful topic for us on today's date, which is National Rosie the Riveter Day. Thank you, Lincoln.
Thank you for inviting me. This is great. Happy Rosie Day.
Thank you.
This is a great opportunity for me. This is an extension of some research I've been doing over the years, and it's perfect timing. So thank you very much, Trust, for inviting me. And the park, if anybody here online has not been to the park, make sure you go. It's the only national park dedicated to telling the home front story. And the U.S. home front during World War II was a remarkable period of history. It's one of the people I know who's logged in. Bob Leninger has done a lot of good research on how the precedent to World War II, which was the Great Depression, fueled a lot of the innovations that we ended up using during World War II to help win the war against fascism. So what I'm going to talk about is this particular little slice, which is dear to me, which has to do with visual imagery. I'm a scholar of political posters, and there's one particular image that has stood out, and I've always had some questions about it, and I've finally been able to come up with some of the answers. So I am going to take over the screen and start a slideshow here. Okay, can y'all see that? Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about is the particular image that we all call Rosie the Riveter, but is she really? There are two images from the American World War II period that have really stood the test of time. One of them is Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph about raising the flag at Iwo Jima. The other one is what We Can Do It, or Rosie the Riveter. And they both have very different trajectories. You know, at the time, the Rosenthal photo was extremely well known and has continued to be so. The story behind the We Can Do It, Rosie the Riveter image is much more complicated, and it's only become famous in recent history, which makes it really unusual. And so that's something that I'm going to drill into here. By the way, this photograph from Joe Rosenthal is signed to my father because they were both working for the Associated Press during World War II in the Pacific. So let's look at this image on the right. by James Howard Miller, who went by J. Howard Miller, 1943. It was originally done, he was hired to do this poster for the Westinghouse Corporation. And during the war, as all the home front industries were, they were, Westinghouse, which had been making consumer products, was making material for winning the war. And almost every company in the United States shifted its production line to, from making bicycles or refrigerators or, whatever, to things that were needed for the war. And this particular plant of Westinghouse was making micarta helmets, these sort of somewhat shatterproof helmets out of micarta, which is a synthetic material. And they had several plants in the Midwest. And in order to encourage production, because you had a lot of new people doing new jobs, they produced a series of posters. They had a thing called the War Production Coordinating Committee. It changed its name a few times over the course of the war. But every home front industry was involved with a relatively new workforce because their standard workforce, the healthy white guys that were working in that industry, were all off fighting the war. And so they had new workers doing new jobs. And there was a whole element of making those jobs productive by propaganda, internal propaganda within the company to encourage productivity, to discourage waste, and so forth. So this was no exception. So for a couple of weeks, this one particular poster was put up in the plants that Westinghouse was making these helmets. Now, it only had a very short life, and it was an in-house, propaganda piece. It wasn't meant to be for public consumption. Turns out that after years of research, Dr. James Kimball, who teaches back east, who's the foremost scholar on this poster and on Miller, finally tracked down the actual woman and the photograph that was involved in creating this image. And here she was. She worked at the Alameda Naval Air Station, which is nearby here. It's just near Oakland here. I live in Berkeley, which is a stone's throw from this. And here she is working in the machine shop. And she finally was tracked down. She died a few years ago, unfortunately, but she was really proud to have become the model for Miller's famous poster. But like I said, this poster was barely known during the war. And even after the war, nobody really knew about it. So what happened? The posters that were made during the war, and most of the media, was, pretty predictable. This one here on the left from the U.S. Employment Service. And the U.S. Employment Service was important because the federal government got involved. Hiring for workers on the job was a really big deal. All of a sudden you had, like I said, different kinds of people doing new jobs. You had women doing jobs. You had people of color doing jobs. You had foreign nationals doing jobs. And so the role of the government in helping to create employment opportunities was really huge. At the same time, these were seen as a threat to many of the unions. So in this unusual period of history, many unions were on the wrong side of history and opposed these new workers coming in. And many employers were on the right side of history and saying, we need all the workers we can get. Let's make it easy as possible. So women were working in these plants. They were doing the jobs that he left behind. This middle one, which is the bosun's whistle, which was the weekly shipyard newspaper at the Kaiser Shipyard in the Northwest area, the Portland area, shows one of the women in the shipyards. Showing women in the workforce was encouraging their role in helping us to win the war. There was this goofy film that was produced called Rosie the Riveter. It really sort of broke the mold. It wasn't typical. Most of this propaganda that was produced during the war was really about encouraging this new workforce to be productive and to be as helpful as possible because we needed these people to win the war. But the thing that people think of when they hear Rosie the Riveter, well, there was a trope that was out there. They had all these women coming into the workforce, and what did they call them? They were either Wendy the Welder or these were names that they came up with Rosie the Riveter. These were general descriptions for women in the workforce. And at first they were sort of a joke. And then they realized, well, we really need these women. And they were slowly accepted into the workforce. But it was an uphill battle. This Norman Rockwell cover for the Saturday Evening Post is really Rosie the Riveter. She is called Rosie the Riveter. She's got good politics. She's got her foot on Mein Kampf. She's just clearly working class gal, sitting there with a giant riveting gun in her lap. She's eating a sandwich, barehanded, no safety equipment, lots of buttons. This was sort of the common image at the time of Rosie the Riveter. You can see I just have this example here because one of my claims is that all art is derivative. Rockwell was no exception. He took this from Michelangelo, but this was what most people think of at the time during the war of Rosie the Riveter. But like I said, the Westinghouse picture by Miller was really obscure. Nobody saw it during the war. People didn't really even see it after the war. So we think of it as being a common World War II image, and it's not. So what happened? Here's an example where the concept of Rosie the Riveter, the women that helped us to win the war, was continuously revitalized. And here's an article by my father talking about the Rosie the Riveters and how they played an important role, but it's just talking about her by this term, the Rosie the Riveter, not using the image that we now associate with Rosie the Riveter. So I wanted to figure out how that image got hooked in. So one step here is the Coalition of Labor Union Women, which was one of the first sort of second wave feminist organizations to take on women in the trades. And they had their founding convention, and an article about them used this great graphic. It's unclear, it's probably unlikely that the cartoonist knew about the Westinghouse image, but it's a similar kind of image. It's a woman showing off her muscle as a working class woman during the war. Then you got the National Archives coming along, and they started to reproduce a series of postcards based on their extensive collection of materials of World War II imagery. And they had this card, in their racks, and this was a cool image, but they didn't call it Rosie the Riveter. It was just, we can do it. But this was the first reproduction of this image. Well, then, in 1980, Connie Field, a Bay Area filmmaker, produced this groundbreaking film about women during the war on the home front and what that meant. And so she used photographs from the war. She didn't use the We Can Do It image because it hadn't been yet popularized. This poster on the right was done by one of my colleagues in San Diego, Connie Young Mills, and some other people. And so this shows already that people reinterpret images about the subject. And so this was a showing in San Diego of the film Rosie, The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter, but she used her own created imagery that shows the transition from before, during World War II, and then after the war, of going back to offices or homes or whatever. So images are flexible and elastic, and so still we don't see the Howard Miller image. Okay, so now we want to introduce the two women that made this happen. Helene Victoria Press, which started off a couple of women in the Los Angeles area, were really interested in promoting women's history, labor history, and they started to produce postcards. They ended up moving to Indiana, and they set up shop there, and they started to do a series of postcards. So these two women really played a key role in the evolution of this image. They began to carry, they went and visited the National Archives. They poked through their cards. They said, wow, you've got several great cards about women during the home front. We want to start carrying some of these. So in their catalog, the Viewing News, they started to show this postcard. and they basically ordered it through the National Archives. They started to carry it, and it was, again, part of their suite of materials highlighting the role of women and labor in our history. It was a very popular card already. Just in their redistribution of it, it started to gain some traction. But still, it's called From Rosie the Riveter Poster, but it was just called We Can Do It. Finally, in '85, they decided to reproduce it themselves. And you'll notice at the top, on the caption on the back, they call it Rosie the Riveter. They also produce a t-shirt. So this is the first time, really, that this image is actually tied to the We Can Do It image and is distributed through the new channels of the labor movement and the second wave feminist movement. So there are several organizations at the time, and you got to realize this is before the internet, before the World Wide Web. How did people hear about posters and postcards and t-shirts? You get a mail order catalog. And so there were several organizations that were very involved in doing national distribution of labor and feminist imagery. One was Northland Poster Collective out of Minneapolis, and one was Syracuse Cultural Workers out of Syracuse, New York. These were where people would go to find posters, postcards, t-shirts, buttons, bumper stickers to sell in their stores, to put up in their schools. This is where they started to carry these. So this catalog describes it as Rosie the Riveter and really begins to make this thing popular. You can see that they start to carry it, they produce it as a poster. It really becomes popular. All of a sudden, it's a large format poster, but it's still called We Can Do It, but it's described as Rosie the Riveter. These two terms now are permanently linked together in description of what this is. So let's talk a little bit about how did this become viral? Just having a cool image and just having national distribution doesn't really explain it. It helps a lot, and it's sort of the missing piece of scholarship about understanding. We now know where the image came from, but we didn't know how it became popularized. At first, I thought it might have been some women's art exhibition or something, and it became clear to me that it was through distribution through mail order catalogs, and I was right about that. But it still doesn't explain why this has become so popular. So one thing I want to look at is, I think that the term, we can do it, which wasn't particularly a popular term during World War II. It was relatively unique at the time. So on the home front, that was cool. And it has real resonance. It's a wonderfully inclusive term. This poster on the left, which was from the anti-war movement in the Bay Area in 1969 and 1970, this slogan started out as, "Hell no, I won't go." Then it became, "Hell no, we won't go." Then it became, "Hell no, nobody goes." The broadened inclusivity of the message is really important and really makes a difference in who your audience is. This middle one here, it occurred to me that the "we can do it" is essentially like a translation of "si se puede." It can be done, which is one way that it's often translated, but it also could be translated as "we can do it." It is possible. It's a mobilization. It's a positive expression of inclusivity, of overcoming obstacles. And even though the farm workers were very active in mass mobilizations and propaganda in the 60s and 70s, this poster was from later, that expression was not really used that much in posters, but it's in this poster. And here on the right, we have from 1980, an expression of using the "we can do it" theme. It's a great message. And I would make the case that from a rhetorical point of view, that's one of the kickers as to why this poster has become so popular. So let's move on to, okay, I say it went viral. Okay, I'm going to prove it. I want to show you just some of the tip of the iceberg of where this thing has gone. I mean, let's start off with some of the goofy things. We've got, anarchists picking up on this image. We've got a math online program using the image. We've got, I was on United Airlines once, and I happened to pick up the magazine. They have this, I think it's a Himalayan woman, reinterpreted, we can do it. This thing on the right where I like that we can do it. It takes the we can do it slogan and uses it as a fundraiser for people to turn in cans for a food drive at Macy's. Moms Rising, which was a women's organization, they did t-shirts. They produced a fake postage stamp of it using a variant of this image. People doing home renovation, educationals. Business Week used this on the cover of talking about the American economy. Also, its role as a feminist icon made it somewhat our image, and it was considered to be something that needed protection from exploitation. So here's a great example from 2013 where this company said, oh, we're going to use this image and we're going to make money on it. And people said no. They got pushed back and they took it down because this was considered to be exploitative of something that was in the commons. This really belongs to the American public and should not be exploited for commercial terms. Yet, again, you've got airlines pushing the low-fare revolution, but mostly it's within the progressive sphere. You've got two, abortion rights organizations that picked up on it because it's a natural for this. You've got multiple political candidates. I mean, I've got to believe that almost every U.S. candidate for office has at one point or another. I mean, you've got Hillary, yeah, sure. Sarah Palin, Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders. I mean, this has become such an iconic image that it's reinterpreted in a million ways. The Rebel Alliance. Okay, sure. I mean, this is a feminist image reinterpreted with this particular graphic. And it's just, I saw this one on the right at the Women's March, a few years ago. This is a hand-drawn sign, and it's unlikely that this person copied it from this poster on the left. Everybody has considered to be sort of fodder for use. And it's just wonderful to see it being taken in a million different ways. But it's a very clean graphic, and it's a great slogan, and it's a great concept. So it's gone a million different ways. It's even gone over the world. I mean, I've literally seen this. This photo on the left was when I was, traveling in Europe, and I saw this on a wall. This is this magazine on the right is an international women's magazine talking about Arab women make their mark in regional business. Hear me roar. I mean, it is no longer simply a U.S. American home front white woman second wave feminist image. It is whatever you want it to be, reinterpreted in a million different ways, and it belongs to the world. It belongs to Ukrainians fighting for independence. I just saw this the other day. This is a web graphic. I mean, this graphic is truly iconic, just as Joe Rosenthal's photo of Iwo Jima, which again has been reinterpreted in a million different ways. So, the trust, which is an important element in keeping the park alive, because the park can't ask for donations. It's a national park, but by God, they really need all the support they can get. Has been able to use at least two different versions of this. Rich Black, who's a Bay Area graphic artist, has done this "We Did It" poster, again, reinterpreting it in a million different ways. I mean, Rosie the Riveter, it didn't come out of the Richmond shipyards, but the Richmond shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards that I was historian for, this was a really important kind of messaging to carry, of supporting the women in the shipyards and honoring the work that they did. And so I'm going to start to roll it up here. I'm going to leave you, there's some resources here that people should look at. If you want to find out more about this, by far the scholar who's really done the most on this is James Kimball. And he's done the groundbreaking, deep, hard work on digging this stuff up. There's a New York Times article that came out when Naomi Parker Fraley died, pointing out how she was really the model for this imagery. I recently posted an article online about this. This talk is an extension of that. And again, as I keep learning more, there are more details to fill in. I mean, you could easily do two PhD theses on this. There's so much more to do, but it's rich, it's deep, and it's remarkably cool content. I really want to do a shout out to the Helene Victoria Press people. Julie Allen has been so supportive in sharing the history of Helene Victoria Press, which I didn't even know about until about 6 months ago as I was doing this research. These are two women that did groundbreaking work in promoting women's and labor history, in Indiana of all places, but they did it. They went there. They were using a cast iron letterpress to produce a lot of the material. They were doing it because this is the same kind of press that people were printing propaganda to support women getting the vote back in the day. And so there's layers and layers of history here that is being revealed by this one image, which has incredible dynamic capacity. And so I'm going to leave it at this and hope people have questions. I'm reachable. You can always email me. I have a website where I have a lot of this content. This is me at one of the Rosie rallies, which, by the way, if you've never been to them, by all means, show up, wear your gear, and it's a wonderful experience to be around people who honor the home front, where our alternative workforce helped to fight fascism and win World War II. This fellow on the right, this is from the Kaiser Shipyard newspaper in Richmond. That's my uncle, who was a steam fitter during World War II and inspired me to continue to do this kind of work. And this link at the bottom is at Kaiser Permanente. There's still a lot of labor histories about the shipyards. You can go and dig into that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and join the party.
Thank you, Lincoln. Let me see. All right. Thank you. Wow, that's fascinating. Really gives me a lot to think about, and now I understand this how it went down and the whole joining of the poster and Rosie the Riveter. And one of our questions, we're having some questions come in. Please definitely add them to the chat. I have a couple questions myself, but I think I'm gonna just go to a couple. Like, where did the name Rosie originate? Was it just that it worked with the song Rosie the Riveter?
Well, the song sort of came out later. The propaganda department from the U.S. government that worked with all these war production boards and various agencies that were both civic and business community, they had to come up with an expression for all these women in the workforce. And so I don't know who coined the term Rosie the Riveter, and there's also Winnie the Welder, because, for instance, in the shipyards, there wasn't a whole lot of riveting going on. There was some riveting. That was mostly welding. And so the welding was a much more appropriate term for the shipyards, whereas in the aircraft industry, there was a lot of riveting going on. So there were various terms that were broadly describing women in the workforce. And this was quickly latched onto by the media as being an expression for women in the workforce.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is a miss is that people today, especially the older generation, the people that did work on the home front, you'll meet women or you'll meet families, and they did work on the home front and they did these jobs, but they don't know that they're Rosie the Riveter. They don't see themselves and they don't consider themselves a Rosie the Riveter until you actually sit down and have the conversation with them. And they said, oh yeah, I worked, maybe they say I worked as a welder, and then you say, oh well, we consider you a Rosie the Riveter, and then it kind of connects and comes together. So I think that can be a miss.
Yeah, a lot of people. I mean, my uncle didn't talk about his shipyard life because he went on to do other things. He was an anthropologist. I mean, a lot of people, for many people, even men, this was a temporary job. For women, many women wanted to be a permanent job. I mean, these were good union jobs. There was equal pay for equal work. We had, Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor. We had a woman promoting, equality in the workforce. This is a really important time for the American labor movement. But, at the end of the war, I mean, even Henry Kaiser, who wanted to keep women in the workforce, he couldn't keep the shipyards alive. There wasn't a need for ships. And his next big thing was building cars. Well, he set up a plant in Willow Run, and that was mostly a UAW male workforce. It was much harder to reintegrate women into the workforce under those circumstances. So even though he wanted to keep women in the workforce, it just wasn't that feasible. So there was this shift in that, but women were key to our winning the war.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, here's a question. It says, is it one of the reasons that Miller's image was easy to reproduce because it wasn't copyrighted? I think Rockwell's image was copyrighted, making it challenging to reproduce.
Right. I showed it here in my slideshow, but other scholars, especially if you're working with an academic institution, which is very gun shy about copyright, didn't reproduce it. So like Olson's article, there's a big black spot saying, we can't reproduce this image. So that's probably part of it. But I think that Rockwell's image isn't as attractive. It's not as empowering an image. You compare the two side by side. If I were going to pick one to make a poster about, I'd pick Miller's picture. It's just a stronger, more empowering image.
Yeah, easy to reproduce. And as you said, and as you showed us so many times over, that people, they take it and they put themselves on there and they, they're doing the pose and it's an easy thing to do. I mean, it's like people love to do that. All right, let's look.
Yeah, one of the staples at the Rosie the Riveter gatherings is that there's a cardboard cutout where you can get behind, put your face in there, and get your picture taken, and it's incredibly popular. It's a long line of people waiting to do that.
Yeah. Now, Lincoln, you mentioned how the trust, and you actually showed it on your last slide, and I have it, behind me. I know that the national park spent a lot of time and being very thoughtful to come up with their own copyrighted, image of for them, what they call a Rosie the Riveter, someone that's in the trades that represent, that can be just representing the national park. And it was important for them to find an image that was, sort of ethnic neutral, if you will. And I think that the other picture that you showed, Rich Black's illustration, we often refer to her as our Richmond Rosie, a Black Rosie. And, I think that's one of the things coming on, taking this role as executive director of the trust is, all right, well, who do we use and, what image do we use and when and how appropriate is it to use a white Rosie or a Black Rosie? And then, I always need special permission to use the park Rosie. I can't use it everywhere. And then I really appreciated what you said, and I just want to read it, what you said, that the Rosie can be whatever you want it to be, and it's it's for interpretation, and that it's the world's image at this point, that everyone has taken it, and they, there's sort of a universal um, just acknowledgement that it's for everyone. But I'm just interested in your comments on how you feel about, here we are an organization that is supporting the national park and the national, this story, which is to be inclusive.
Well, I mean, that's one reason that I am particularly drawn to the park is this national park is really changing the landscape of what national parks are in many ways. One is that it's a park without owning any land. I mean, it's a park that, it takes advantage of the fact that it's on a site that's owned by other people, but it's not like you're going to Yosemite where it's owned by the federal or the state government. So it's unusual that way, and it sort of opens the channels for more urban parks, but also it really does tell a very inclusive story, and the role of Betty Reed Soskin is permanently intermingled with the evolution of this park. And that's one of the reasons why I know that Kaiser Permanente was very involved in supporting this, is because from the very beginning of it, it had the potential for a very inclusive message, because the shipyards, even though shipyards were mostly white, they were also, the home front was an opportunity for people of color to enter trades that they never had an opportunity before. And it was an uphill battle. And like I said, the unions fought it. The Boilermakers especially, didn't allow Black workers until the very end after major lawsuits. Women couldn't get in until they picketed the union and said, "You've got to let us in." I mean, this was a very backward union at the beginning. Of course, now they're totally cool. They love the story. They love the fact that they've evolved so much. But during World War II, this was an uphill battle. I mean, you talk about, riveters and welders, there weren't a lot of Black women doing those jobs. When they were working in the shipyards, they were sweeping up. They were doing the cleaning. They were doing the, chipping, which is a job where you basically it's like a riveter, except that you're just chipping away all the garbage. It's not a very exciting job. It's a dangerous job. A lot of the really crappy jobs were going to the people of color and to the women. So there's a whole backstory to why this is an important story. But I love the fact that Rosie is transformed into this, multi-ethnic character, because she should be. That's really the home front story. Our messaging during World War II was, the Germans were all about the master Aryan race. We're all about, we're inclusive and diverse. Well, it wasn't quite so perfect, but that was the message. And realistically, we were better than the Nazis when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So the messaging during the war was really important. And a lot of the stuff produced, there was a question I see about, Westinghouse and the image, and was it copyrighted? A lot of the stuff produced by the government agencies, government agencies don't copyright their stuff. And the National Archives reproducing it, it's copyright free. If you want to reproduce it, this is, your tax dollars paid for it. You as a citizen can use it. So it didn't have that barrier that the Saturday Evening Post as a copyrighted publication had, or by a famous artist with a big estate with deep pockets of Norman Rockwell. So it had a whole different kind of legal binding than Miller's image did.
Mm-hmm. All right. One from Diane Hedler, our board member. Women did other jobs, and they did not consider themselves Rosie the Riveters or as valuable. They were not Rosies, even though they were not in the military, but filled jobs for men who were fighting that helped the war effort. Can they be part of this history?
Absolutely. There were women who were, one of the women that I focused on in the history that I gave a presentation earlier is Emmylou Packard, who's a Bay Area artist. She was, during the last year and a half of the war, She worked for the Kaiser Richmond newspaper, shipyard newspaper, doing illustrations about women in the trades. Fantastic, wonderful illustrations that show the double shift that women would face when they'd be working all day and then go home and have to feed their hungry kids and clean up the kitchen and take care of their husband who's also stressed out. I mean, it's the role of women in the workforce and the role of women in the shipyards is really crucial. And there are women who worked not in the shipyards. I mean, Betty Reed Soskin worked for the black union that she never saw a ship being built, but she's really part of this history. Mm-hmm. So the history being told at the Rosie the Riveter Park is not just building ships or riveting airplanes. It's all the ancillary trades and skills, running the child care centers. That was the Maritime Commission that was doing that. And the school districts that were doing that, building housing for all the workers. I mean, all these different aspects of what it took to support the war effort is huge. And that story hasn't been properly told. Mm-hmm. And everybody played a role one way or another. You couldn't have survived during World War II and not had some contribution to the war effort. And those stories really need to be told because they're really important and they're honorable. They're questions that people should ask their mothers or their grandmothers or their aunts.
Well, and also their fathers and their uncles. I mean, I think that they are part of the family history, and I think they're relevant today. And they're relevant today because we're struggling with some of the same issues today. If you talk about childcare, that's number one. And then also that they are inspiring for our youth today. When you're talking about a lot of our work, when we're working with our youth programs, we use the history, we use the stories of what happened on the home front and our Rosies to inspire our youth. Lincoln, can you tell us a little bit about what you know about the film that Connie Field did? Is that something that is that a film you have seen?
I saw it back in the 80s. I haven't seen it recently. Connie, another Bay Area person. She works here in Berkeley. And it's important. I mean, this film was really a big breakthrough because it was really showing the role of women in the workforce during the home front. And it had a whole second wave feminist shaping of it. And it was really crucial to the evolution of, tradeswomen. And the Bay Area has been a real strong proponent of women in the trades. There was Tradeswomen magazine, and there was a whole organization that was promoting, later, women getting into the trades in the 80s and 90s. And so films like, The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter were really crucial to that, of giving another dimension to this history that people hadn't asked their parents or their grandparents, what did you do during the war? Because they weren't fighting the war, but they were fighting discrimination. They were fighting, on the job hassles. They were fighting workplace injury. I mean, like I said, these were new people doing new jobs under a lot of stress. There was a lot of workplace injury. And so the whole role of occupational safety and health was really crucial. I mean, the modern disability rights movement began at the end of World War II when there was a giant conference about all these disabled workers who were either too injured to go into the workforce, or who were injured during the war, and they said, where is there a place for us? The shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards, were specifically organized so that there was a place for every single worker, no matter what possible physical disability you had. And they literally produced a book showing you if you can't walk, you can do these jobs. If you can't hear, you're good for these jobs. Everybody had a place on the home front. It was non-discriminatory because they couldn't afford to be discriminatory.
Right.
So there are all these consequences of the American home front that have really not been told.
Right. That are needed today, that are inspiring and
Totally.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's a missing piece as a question. If the image was not iconic during the war years, and riveting wasn't the main only women's job, how did Rosie the Riveter become the choice to represent all homefront women workers?
Well, like I said, there were other terms like Wendy the Welder, but it just Rosie the Riveter stuck. It already had some traction from the home front, and I mean, if you're going to pick any particular trade, you might as well pick riveting. It's sort of cool, and it makes as much sense as anything to me. But again, if somebody wants to do more research on this, there's a lot to learn. We are still just scratching the surface of this stuff. And this research that I've recently done adds another element to it, but it is not by far the end of it. There's always plenty to do, and I really welcome more people to jump in. Everybody that I've talked to on this has been so supportive and encouraging. I mean, we're telling our story, and there's plenty of room for people to contribute.
I love that. I love that. It's just like, and it's a bit of a snowball, right? It's like it starts off with, okay, there was a poster, and then there was, then it gets joined with this name, and then all of a sudden it's attached to this name, and it's going down, and then it's all the home front workers, and this is where we are today, and how is it going to get known, a decade or 50 to 100 years from now. There's people are writing in the chats. We know that there are other films. The Invisible Warriors absolutely tells the story of the Black Rosies. That is not a finalized production. And I also do want to do a shout out. Lisa Foote, who is on here and works with the trust, is also just released actually this weekend during Riveter Days. We have a film called Living History, and that's about our Rosie ambassadors, we call them. They worked many of them worked at Kaiser Shipyards, and then they have been docents at our national park. And this is a film about them. So what we're doing is we're really working to get the footage of the people, of the Rosies who have been there at the home front and have had this special role of telling the story to the public. Just as you said, Betty Reed Soskin, we produced a documentary called No Time to Waste. Fantastic. It's up on our website. Highly recommend it. This is a new film, and Lincoln, we got to get you in for you to see it. And we do. Yeah, you're in it. Have you seen it? Did you come down yesterday to see it?
No, but I've seen it. But Betty Reed is such a treasure because, as the park was forming, she was thinking, I never thought about being part of World War II history because I did this job, and then she moved on to other things, and she put it in the background like many people did. But her contribution to helping to tell the broader story is awesome. And not only is she an individual who's an incredible person, but she's been able to draw out all these other layers of the World War II home front that probably wouldn't have happened. If this park had been set up in Willow Run, Michigan, which it could have, because that's also part of the home front, it's unlikely that this would have been the same thing. So I really want to shout out to all the people that have stuck their neck out, especially the women and people of color, the city of Richmond, the forlorn city that, got beat up after the war, but was really playing an important role during the war and is now sort of seeing a revitalization, but it's a challenge. How do you bring back a city that, hasn't had a good time? Well, Richmond is really an important city. It's a very diverse city. It's got this incredible history to it, and the park and the trust are key elements to that.
Thank you. Well, yeah. Well, we certainly love to meet people and talk to historians such as yourself or anyone that is interested. I know I recognize a number of the people that are on here right now who have definitely, I've had some incredible conversations just based on their interest of what's important to them in terms of history and what they're looking towards. And I think that that's what's a beautiful thing. I'll just do a plug for this Rosie Presents series is we love having people like you on Lincoln. And we really look forward to having other scholars and people that are just have something that they want to talk about. This is a great platform, I think. We'll do it sometimes in person, but it's also a great platform to be able to do virtually so we can all come together, learn something new. I always come away feeling inspired and thinking about, oh, what else do I want to learn, right? Like now I want to look into that film. Now I understand things, the points are coming together. So I really appreciate, I just want to thank you so much for coming together with us tonight, and look forward to seeing you again as always, and big fan.
I got one more thing, which is instead of starting with a land acknowledgement, I want to end with a land acknowledgement, because the homefront history includes Native Americans, and the shipyards were built on what was empty land, which I'm sure at one point or another had been occupied by Ohlone and other local tribes. I mean, this is not, just because it didn't have dwellings on it doesn't mean that it wasn't used by somebody. And when Henry Kaiser built the shipyards there and in the Portland area, this was land which had been otherwise occupied by other people for whom we owe a great debt. And the homefront workforce included many Native Americans. We know about the code talkers and so forth, but we don't know about, there were many Native Americans that were involved in homefront production. And there were even ship launchings in the Northwest that were dedicated to local tribes who had workers on building the ships. So there was even an effort at the time. I mean, it was stunted and sort of backhanded racist at the time, but at least it was an effort to acknowledge this diversity and democracy of the workforce to fight fascism. And so there's a lot more to go to broaden the narrative and to really make the homefront history our true history, warts and all. And I thank you for this opportunity to tell it.
Absolutely, and we want people to come in and let's talk about them. Let's include the Native Americans. Let's also, we as the trust are dedicated to being inclusive in our story. So is the park. We would love to do, our dream is just getting started. I mean, we would like to do short documentaries, and so that we can show them in the theater at the visitor center. I hope everyone has visited the park. Like Lincoln said, it's fantastic. Open 7 days a week. It's free. It's beautiful on the bay. Go there. Yep, you can do it. But we do show movies there, and this is something that the trust would like to continue doing, is broadening the story by producing these short stories, these movies about the variety of the homefront. Thank you. We're getting a lot of amazing comments. Wow, truly amazing and inspiring. Lincoln, we can't thank you enough. Everyone, happy Rosie
Thank you all.
Day.
Long live the Rosies. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.